Good afternoon, ma'am. My topic is legitimate expectation. My name is Shalini Verma from 4th T. Firstly, I have introduced my topic by giving its meaning in the first slide, and that is my topic is legitimate expectation. The expectation of general public to the government, which is reasonable and which is justifiable, uh, that which that is called legitimate expectation. A public authority can be held accountable to the general public if it is uh, arbitrary in some sense. The court also uses several tools to review administrative actions of the administrative authority, including this doctrine, which is legitimate expectation. This doctrine of legitimate expectation also establishes a relationship between an individual and a government authority. Now, origin of doctrine of legitimate expectation. The doctrine of legitimate expectation is not enshrined in any of the legislation or any any of set of rules. It was earliest developed in the case of Council of Civil Service Union and others versus Minister for the Civil Service 1985, and in the other case being Breen versus Amalgamated ENG Union. Lord Denning held that if a person has legitimate expectation, then it won't be fair to deprive him from being heard. If we deprive him from being heard, then in some way we are denying justice to him. So he must be afforded to be heard. In the Indian scenario, this doctrine of legitimate expectation was firstly discussed in the case of the state of Kerala versus KG Madhavan Pillai 1988. In the case of Supreme Court Advocates on Record Association versus Union of India, Supreme Court held that in recommending appointment to Supreme Court, due consideration of every legitimate expectation has to be observed by Chief Justice of India. So how such expectations arises? By express promise, if there is any implied promise by any by the by the administrative authority or by government, then the general public expects the government to be accountable in that matter. Secondly, by existence of regular practice, if there has been a regular practice regarding government being accountable to the general public, then also the this legitimate expectation arises. Yes. And thirdly, the practice of being clear and unambiguous. If there is, like, it should be clear that the government is accountable to the public in particular matter, or in uh, in any particular matter the government is really accountable to the general public or not, then the such expectation arises. So these has led this doctrine of legitimate expectation to be as principle of natural justice. So by evolving, this doctrine of legitimate expectation has also become a principle of natural justice. Uh, so there are some circumstances which form the legitimate expectation, which I have discussed in the previous slide. These three circumstances have been discussed in the case of the Madras City Wine Merchants versus the State of Tamil Nadu 1994. In the case of Banari Aman Sugars Limited, it was held that safeguarding valid expectations should not come at the expense of not fulfillment of overriding public interest, implying that if a person's reasonable expectation is not met, the decision-making body might use the guise of overriding public interest. Now, I have discussed the legitimate expectation with regard to Article 14. The doctrine's application has been basically enshrined in Article 14 of the Constitution, and therefore non-arbitrariness and unreasonableness have been declared fundamental criteria for determining whether a denial of legitimate expectation occurred or not. Actually, the criteria which have been set as fundamental criteria for determining whether the any public authority is actually denying the legitimate expectation or not, have made this doctrine a bit obsolete. So there is a need to lower the norms as qualifiers for the doctrine to grow individually. There are also some limitations. Firstly, it's only procedural and has no substantive impact. It is a procedural doctrine and it has no substantive impact. Secondly, it does not apply to legitimate activities. Like if government imposes or makes some new rules regarding taxation, then the general public won't be entertained to be accountable entertained for the government to be accountable to it. Does not apply if it is contrary or to public policy or against security of state. if uh, if any law or rule has been made for the interest of public policy, or which is securing the state, then obvious and doesn't does not entertain the privilege of legitimate expectation, then obviously the principle of doctrine of legitimate expectation will be denied in this case, if it is about security purposes. So in conclusion, uh, the necessity of application of doctrine of legitimate expectation arises when an administrative body, by reason of a representation or by past practice or conduct, state an expectation which would be within its powers to accomplish under unless some superseding public interest comes in the way. Here, the court only will interfere in the decision making by the authority. Uh, Decision making of the authority if the authority found arbitrary, unreasonable, or in gross abuse of power, or in violation of principle of natural justice, not otherwise. Thank you, ma'am.